The crew didn't just go quiet, they froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. Boots stopped shifting against gravel. Even the wind felt like it had stepped back to watch. At the edge of that cliff, 40 feet above a narrow ribbon of water, Paul Newman turned to Robert Redford and made it simple. If he jumped, Redford jumped. No stunt double, no cutaway, just them. You can imagine the weight of that moment, can't you? Not the glamour, not the legend, the raw, unfiltered risk. Below them, the river looked forgiving from a distance, but everyone there knew better. 12 feet deep at best, rocks lurking just beneath the surface. Enter wrong, hesitate for half a second, and the impact wouldn't bruise pride, it would shatter spines. The stunt coordinator's face said what protocol demanded. This was reckless. Careers could collapse as quickly as bodies. Insurance would vanish, production would shut down, lives could change in one misjudged breath. And Redford? He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the drop, measuring something invisible. Fear, loyalty, pride. The silence stretched longer than it should have, because sometimes the loudest pressure isn't a shout, it's the expectation hanging in the air, waiting for you to decide who you are. To understand how two seasoned professionals ended up at the edge of something that dangerous, you have to rewind to a moment that felt harmless. It started the way most irreversible decisions do, casually, a drink in hand, laughter bouncing around the room, a conversation about realism in film, about how much the audience can actually feel. One of the stunt doubles was explaining the mechanics of a high fall, talking about angles, water depth, body control, technical, controlled, measured. And then Newman asked a simple question. Can viewers tell when it isn't really us? It wasn't confrontational, it was curious. But curiosity, when mixed with ego, has a way of sharpening into something else. He kept pressing. If the jump is the emotional peak of the story, shouldn't it be authentic? Shouldn't the audience believe we made that choice? The stunt team answered carefully, outlining limits, probabilities, risks. They spoke the language of physics and experience. But underneath the technical explanations was an unspoken boundary. This is our job, not yours. And that's when the energy shifted. Because for someone driven by excellence, being told something is off limits doesn't feel protective, it feels restrictive. Then came the remark that changed everything. A throwaway line, half joking, about how manageable the jump could be with the right form. You've seen this before in your own life, haven't you? One sentence that plants a seed, one suggestion that transforms possibility into personal challenge. Newman heard more than reassurance. He heard opportunity. If it's possible, then why not him? If it can be done, why pretend? And once that thought takes hold, pride quietly steps in and begins negotiating on your behalf. Redford sensed it immediately. He pushed back. This isn't necessary. That's what stunt doubles are for. There was logic in his resistance, a steady awareness of consequences, but logic struggles when identity is at stake. Because now the conversation wasn't about safety, it was about commitment, about authenticity, about whether they were willing to embody the risk their characters portrayed. And in a room full of peers, where reputations breathe just as loudly as people, social pressure thickened the air. Notice how escalation rarely feels dramatic in the beginning. It feels incremental and then suddenly irreversible. Newman's commitment forced Redford into a decision he didn't ask for. If he refused, he risked appearing cautious in a culture that celebrates boldness. If he agreed, he risked injury, perhaps worse. That's the cruel geometry of pride. It builds no-win scenarios. Stand down and you question who you are. Step forward and you gamble everything. Once pride steps in, the conversation changes its shape. What was once a possibility becomes a position. Newman didn't retreat after the first wave of resistance. He leaned forward. He reframed the jump not as recklessness, but as integrity. If they were asking an audience to believe in courage, shouldn't they embody it themselves? That subtle shift matters, because now backing down isn't just about safety, it feels like compromise. And for someone who has built a reputation on authenticity, compromise tastes like failure. Redford felt the trap tightening. At first, he had logic on his side. There were professionals for this. protocol existed for a reason. But when Newman doubled down, the question stopped being practical and started being personal. If Paul was willing to leap, what did hesitation say about him? You know this pressure. It isn't spoken outright, but it hums beneath the surface. In certain rooms, among certain people, identity is always being measured, not loudly, quietly, in glances, in pauses, in who moves first. The stunt coordinator drew a firm line. His refusal wasn't dramatic, it was grounded. He understood physics, angles, consequences. He had seen what happens when confidence outruns control. To him, this wasn't about pride, it was about probability. But authority can only go so far when autonomy is challenged. The more he insisted it couldn't happen, the more it began to feel like something that must. Because when someone in power says no, the ego hears a dare. And then the director found himself suspended between worlds. On one side, creative ambition and two leading men determined to prove something. On the other, insurance policies, studio executives, contracts, reputations built over decades. This is where stakes multiply. It's no longer just about a jump. It's about whether a production collapses, whether millions of dollars evaporate, whether careers, carefully constructed, fracture in a single afternoon. The pressure isn't linear, it layers. Life, livelihood, legacy. Notice how escalation rarely feels explosive. It feels incremental and then suddenly irreversible. Newman's commitment forced Redford into a decision he didn't ask for. If he refused, he risked appearing cautious in a culture that celebrates boldness. If he agreed, he risked injury, perhaps worse. That's the cruel geometry of pride. It builds no-win scenarios. Stand down and you question who you are. Step forward and you gamble everything.
The more resistance they encountered, the more inevitable it became. Insurance warnings, studio oversight, whispered concerns about reputation, all of it should have slowed them. Instead, it intensified the resolve. Because once identity is entangled with action, retreat feels like betrayal, not just of a project, but of self. And when commitment becomes tied to masculinity, to courage, to the story you tell about yourself, logic loses volume. What began as an idea hardened into certainty, not because it was wise, but because pride, once fed, demands consistency. And consistency, in moments like this, can look indistinguishable from destiny. Commitment is loud in conversation, but it becomes quiet in preparation. Before the world is watching, before pride is tested in public, there is the private work no one applauds. That's where this shifted again. Early mornings, before the rest of the crew stirred, they began training. No cameras, no audience, just repetition. Smaller jumps first, measured distances, controlled entries. Because desire alone doesn't carry you safely through gravity. Discipline does. Newman adapted quickly. His confidence wasn't reckless in these moments, it was focused. He trusted his body, trusted the mechanics, trusted that practice could bridge the gap between ambition and execution. There's something seductive about early success, isn't there? When the first attempts go smoothly, the mind begins to whisper, maybe this isn't so impossible. Maybe I was right all along. Competence builds momentum, and momentum strengthens belief. Redford approached it differently. He hesitated longer at the edge of each lower platform. You could see the calculation behind his eyes. Not fear in its purest form, but awareness. Awareness of height, of consequence, of the thin margin between clean execution and irreversible error. That tension made him more deliberate. Every movement was considered, every breath intentional. And in that contrast, you see something honest about human nature. Some of us charge forward to conquer doubt. Others move carefully to respect it. The stunt coordinator watched it all with guarded skepticism. At first, his involvement felt reluctant, almost defensive. He had drawn his boundary, he knew the risks. But as the days progressed and the form improved, something subtle shifted. Authority, when faced with consistent effort, softens. He corrected their posture, adjusted their timing, demanded tighter form. Not because he approved of the ambition, but because if it was going to happen, it had to be precise. That transition matters. Refusal turned into supervision, opposition became reluctant guidance. And then came the moment that unsettled everyone. One jump slightly off. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, but imperfect. An arm drifting wider than it should, a minor tilt on entry. Enough to remind them that mastery isn't guaranteed. You can train, you can visualize, you can build confidence brick by brick, and still, gravity does not negotiate. That near miss carried more weight than the clean attempts before it, because perfection builds hope, but imperfection restores humility. Here's the lesson hidden inside this phase. Progress creates belief, but doubt keeps you alive. Too much confidence blinds you. Too much fear paralyzes you. The balance is where transformation happens. Each practice jump was a small climax, a test of whether preparation could quiet uncertainty. With every clean entry, the possibility of the final leap felt closer. With every flaw, it felt fragile again. That fragile space is where real growth lives. Not in bravado, not in applause, but in the quiet repetition where you discover whether your conviction can withstand correction. And by the time training ended, they weren't certain, they were capable. Capable is more dangerous than confident because capability makes the risk feel earned. Then reality pressed its weight against them. A call from the insurance office arrived, calm in tone but unyielding in content. If anyone attempted that jump, coverage would be immediately withdrawn. No policy, no protection, no safety net. Imagine receiving that call while knowing two men are poised to defy reason, to flirt with consequences measured in broken bones or worse. The threat of production shutdown followed quickly, an invisible hand hovering over months of planning, hundreds of crew members, and countless resources. Every protocol, every contingency suddenly amplified the stakes beyond the physical. Safety was no longer just a personal matter, it was a contractual, legal, and moral web. The director, caught in the middle, had to promise compliance, to swear that the jump would not happen, yet in the same breath he understood the fragility of that assurance. He recognized how easily one act of pride could unravel a meticulously balanced system. And he also understood the weight of trust, unspoken yet undeniable, pressing from his actors. Newman saw the tension, the invisible barriers, and he proposed a quiet solution: secrecy. Not out of malice, not out of cunning, but because the leap mattered more than the rules imposed from afar. By keeping the plan contained, he framed the choice as one of authenticity and compromise. Bravery, in his mind, demanded a certain moral flexibility. The gray area between heroism and recklessness became a field for testing identity, for proving commitment. Redford sensed the tension, the precarious moral ground. They weren't just challenging gravity, they were challenging authority, conventions, and the very definition of responsibility. And yet, isn't that the nature of great leaps, whether literal or figurative? That which inspires awe is often encased in risk, wrapped in complexity, and complicated by the frameworks meant to contain it. Every whispered conversation, every cautious glance, every calculated pause expanded the stakes. The risk wasn't just falling, it was failure on multiple levels: career, conscience, and courage.
In that crucible, the audience, the studio, the world beyond the cliff line had no power to intervene. The choice belonged entirely to those who had dared to imagine it possible. What does it mean to defy not only physics, but the systems built to protect you? What does it mean when moral certainty collides with personal conviction? In that space, tension swells and decisions crystallize. They felt the full weight of scrutiny, yet it only sharpened their resolve. Secrecy, rebellion, calculation, and courage interlaced, creating a tension that hovered over every heartbeat. Every layer of institutional pressure, every potential repercussion multiplied the stakes and clarified what mattered most: authenticity over instruction, action over restraint, and the unspoken truth that some choices demand the courage to embrace the gray, the uncertain, and the dangerous. The world held its breath. Every voice, every shuffle, every distant echo faded into silence, leaving only the sharp whisper of the wind against the cliff and the distant rush of the river far below. Time seemed elastic, stretching each heartbeat into a slow, deliberate measure. The stunt coordinator's voice cut through, precise and calm, delivering final instructions that felt like guidance and warning. Arms tight, chin tucked, toes pointed, one wrong move and it's over. Did anyone truly hear those words, or did the mind filter them as ritual before inevitability? Height pressed against perception, a tangible weight, and the distance between cliff edge and water seemed to grow with every tick of the invisible clock. Dust shifted under boots, a sudden swirl in the air, reminding everyone that gravity was indifferent to fame, ambition, or courage.
Newman stepped forward first, deliberate, steady, a figure of quiet resolve. He didn't glance back. He didn't hesitate. The muscles in his legs flexed, the grip of his fingers tightened, and the subtle tilt of his torso signaled a body attuned to movement, to momentum, to control. Could confidence alone bend physics, or was it simply a clarity of choice? The drop stretched visually, a slow cascade of air and anticipation, every second elongated in the minds of those who watched. Redford remained at the edge, still, breathing measured. Each inhale carried tension, each exhale weighed against loyalty, pride, and fear. When he finally stepped forward, it wasn't impulse, but a deliberate commitment, a conscious surrender to trust, to shared purpose. Can hesitation sharpen courage, or merely remind us of what we stand to lose? Then they were airborne, suspended between decision and consequence. Wind rushed past ears, clothes snapped against skin, hair lifted in rebellion against gravity. The world flattened into elongated shapes, the glint of the river, the irregular pattern of rocks hidden beneath, the blur of cliff face behind. The narrative of the leap unfolded as if in slow motion, and for a heartbeat, two men became both actors and myth-makers, defining risk, trust, and friendship in a single measurable arc. Can you feel the second stretch, the vertigo of choice, the intimacy of danger shared? Every motion was a punctuation in the sentence of their commitment, arms locked, bodies aligned, intent clear. The entry approached, a precise collision of expectation and reality, and for 2 seconds, uncertainty ruled. Was the landing clean? Was the risk justified? Could preparation overcome consequence? Then water received them. The impact was immediate, violent yet contained, a shock to the senses that brought each mind fully into the present. Silence shattered into gasps, laughter, relief, disbelief. Newman's head surfaced first, eyes wide, chest heaving, grin breaking across his face. Redford followed, steady, breathing deep,
eyes scanning the horizon, processing the moment, absorbing survival as both triumph and relief. The river embraced them equally, washing away fear, hesitation, and doubt. In that instant, the impossible became reality, and everyone who witnessed it understood the delicate balance between preparation and courage, between pride and prudence. It was over, yet timeless. How often do we encounter moments where the heart outruns certainty, and for a fleeting second, life feels fully suspended, fully earned? When the last ripple faded and the water stilled, the crew exhaled as if collectively emerging from a held breath. Shock lingered in their expressions, a mixture of disbelief and awe, until relief gradually softened the tension knotted into their shoulders. It was more than survival. It was witnessing something that defied expectation, something that transcended the rules they had spent their careers enforcing. The director, standing a few paces away, rubbed his eyes and leaned against the trailer, quiet disbelief etched across his face. How had he allowed this to happen? How had he underestimated the power of two actors driven not just by ambition, but by the invisible currency of loyalty and pride? And yet the cameras had captured everything, and the footage spoke for itself. The sequence would become iconic, immortal in its simplicity and its risk. The stunt coordinator, who had spent decades safeguarding bodies and careers, felt a conflict he could hardly reconcile. Pride and competence battled with horror at what might have occurred. Watching Newman and Redford rise from the water, triumphant and unscathed, he felt a grudging respect for the calculated courage, but beneath it all, a quiet fear lingered. What if he had been wrong? What if preparation had failed? That moral complexity is rarely celebrated publicly, yet it shapes every decision behind the scenes. And that was part of the story no one would ever fully know. The public would see the jump, remember the thrill, and call it daring, cinematic, or legendary. Few would grasp the invisible threads of risk, trust, and responsibility that held it together. Over time, the jump transcended its immediate spectacle. It became a symbol, not of recklessness, but of the delicate architecture of friendship. Two men standing at the precipice, not testing gravity alone, but testing their bond. It asks a subtle question. What would you risk for someone whose trust you cannot afford to betray? The myth grew quietly, carried in anecdotes, in interviews, in the whisper of awe among those who knew the truth. The cliff remained, the water flowed as it always had, and the moment lingered, an emblem of human courage intertwined with moral fidelity. In reflection, the lesson becomes clear. It was never about proving bravery to an audience or conquering fear for the sake of spectacle. It was about embodying trust, making a silent promise to another human being that your actions would honor their faith in you. Friendship, in this case, demanded more than loyalty. It required action under extreme pressure, precision aligned with empathy, and courage tempered by understanding. Can one ever truly measure such an act? Perhaps not. Its weight is found in the quiet knowledge that some risks, some leaps, are worth taking only because of who stands beside you. And so the legacy persists. The footage thrills audiences, but the true resonance lives in the unseen. The sigh of relief after the fall, the subtle nods exchanged on shore, the unspoken acknowledgement that history had been made not just by stunts, but by the trust that allowed two men to leap together, survive together, and define what it means to honor a friendship at the edge of impossibility.